Right before the vows, my daughter slipped a folded note from her bouquet into my hand. It read, "Dad, he stole $1.2 million from your account. Don't let this happen." I looked up at the groom. He stood at the altar, smiling like he'd already won. I gave one slow nod. My revenge began in that exact moment. He had no idea his game was over. Before continuing, subscribe to the channel and write in the comments what time it is in your region right now. My name is Ralph Gardner. I'm 64 years old, and I live on Sullivan's Island, just outside Charleston, South Carolina, a thin strip of land where the salt air comes off the Atlantic and gets into everything. Your clothes, your furniture, the pages of your books. I spent 31 years as a senior U.S. Customs inspector at the Port of Charleston before I put in my papers and retired. These days I restore old maps, drink coffee on the porch, and watch the water. Most people would call that a quiet life. I called it exactly what I'd earned. I'm not a complicated man. I notice things. That's the habit 31 years at a customs checkpoint will burn into you permanently. You learn to read a face the way other people read a menu. You learn the difference between a person who's nervous because they've never crossed an international border before and a person who's nervous because there's something in the lining of their luggage they'd rather you didn't find. After a while, that skill doesn't turn off. You carry it home. You carry it to every dinner table, every handshake, every conversation. It's not a gift. It's just a thing that happens to you when you've spent 3 decades watching people try to hide what they are. My daughter Nicole is 31. She has her mother's jaw and my stubbornness, which is a combination that has served her well and occasionally driven me to the edge of reason. She's an account manager at a logistics firm downtown, good at her job, careful with money. She learned that from watching me, I think, though she'd probably deny it. Nicole is the one person in my life I've never once felt the need to read. She's always been exactly what she appeared to be. Cody Fletcher came into our lives about 2.5 years ago. He was 34 at the time, originally from Atlanta, with the kind of handshake that men practice in front of mirrors. He sold commercial real estate, or said he did. He drove a leased Mercedes he referred to as the car, never my car, which I noticed immediately and filed away under things that might mean nothing and things that might mean everything. He was charming in the specific, effortful way that tells you a person has decided charm is their primary tool. Nicole lit up around him. That was real. Whatever else was or wasn't true about Cody Fletcher, her happiness when he walked into a room was not manufactured. I watched it for 2.5 years, and I never doubted it. That was the part that made everything harder. The first time he came to dinner, he walked through my front room and stopped at the map wall. I have 2 framed pieces there I'm particularly proud of. An 1847 coastal survey of the Charleston Harbor and an 1891 topographic of the Sea Islands. He looked at them for about 4 seconds, said cool collection, and moved on to ask where the bathroom was. Nicole was watching me with that particular expression she uses when she's hoping I won't say something her father would say. I smiled pleasantly. 31 years of customs work teaches you to smile pleasantly while you're thinking something entirely different. The financial questions started gradually. About 8 months in, Cody mentioned at dinner that he was looking at a real estate investment and asked, almost as a footnote, what my pension situation looked like. I told him it was comfortable. He nodded. 6 weeks later, he asked about the house, a gentle probe about equity financing. I told him I had no interest in financing anything at this stage. Nicole didn't notice these questions. She trusted him, and she trusted me to say something if something was wrong. I kept telling myself I was overreacting, but I kept noticing things. The way he'd pause before answering anything numerical, the way he'd redirect conversations drifting toward specifics about his work, the vague references to the Atlanta office, the Charleston deal, the transition period, a portrait of a man whose financial life existed primarily as a sketch. I told myself I was being the difficult father. Nicole was happy. I kept the suspicion in its box and went back to my maps. The bank statement arrived on a Tuesday morning, the way bank statements do, unremarkably in a plain envelope, sitting on top of a catalog for outdoor furniture. I opened it at the kitchen table with my second cup of coffee. I'm methodical about finances. I review every line. 31 years of customs work will do that to you, too. You develop a fundamental belief that the details are where the truth lives. The transaction was on page 2. A wire transfer dated about 7 weeks prior. $340,000. Recipient listed as a Delaware LLC with a name that meant nothing to me. 3 generic words strung together the way fake companies string words together when nobody intends for anyone to look too closely. I put my coffee cup down. I sat with that number for a while. $340,000. I had not authorized any wire transfer. I had not spoken to anyone at the bank about any transaction of that size. I did not recognize the recipient. The account it had come from was my personal investment account, the one I'd been building since I was 38 years old. $400 here, $600 there. The patient accumulation of a man who understood that wealth built slowly was the only kind that stayed. I turned the page over, read it again. Same number. Same date. Same unfamiliar LLC. I set the statement on the table and looked out at the water through the kitchen window. The Atlantic was flat that morning, the way it gets in early fall before the weather turns. Quiet and completely indifferent to the fact that something had just cracked open in my kitchen. I thought about Cody Fletcher's handshake, the practiced primary tool kind. I thought about the word comfortable and how much I'd revealed by saying it. Then I picked up my phone and called the bank. The branch manager's name was Patricia Weston, a careful woman in her late 50s, who had the particular expression of someone delivering bad news they've had to deliver before. She pulled up my account on her screen, turned the monitor slightly toward me, and said, "Mr. Gardner, are you familiar with the general power of attorney on file for your accounts?" I told her I was not. She turned the monitor fully toward me. The document was 3 pages. It bore my name, my address, my social security number, and, at the bottom of the 3rd page, what appeared to be my signature. Notarized, dated 2 months prior. I looked at that signature for a long time. It was close. Whoever had done it had done their homework. The R was shaped correctly, the G had the right lean, but the pressure was wrong, too uniform the way a copied signature is always too uniform, because the person copying it is being careful when the real signer never is. After 31 years of examining documents at a port of entry, I know the difference between a signature that was written by a human being in the ordinary carelessness of a moment and a signature that was drawn. That signature was drawn. "I did not sign this document," I said. Patricia Weston looked at her screen. "Mr. Gardner, this document was executed before a licensed notary." "I understand what it says it is," I told her. "I'm telling you what it isn't." She closed her mouth. I asked her to pull up the full transaction history for all accounts connected to my name. She did. We sat together and worked through it quietly, line by line, the way I used to work through cargo manifests, methodically, without rushing, because rushing is how you miss the thing that matters. By the time we finished, the number was $1,200,000, not $340,000. That had been the first transfer I'd noticed because it was the most recent. Before it, $510,000 moved out of a joint investment account I hadn't opened and didn't know existed until Patricia showed it to me. Opened in my name using the power of attorney, then liquidated. And before that, $350,000 extracted through a refinancing of my Sullivan's Island property, executed against a lien I'd never approved. The proceeds wired to a second Delaware LLC, different name, same architecture. 3 moves, 12 weeks, $1,200,000. I remember sitting in that bank chair thinking about a map I have, an 1842 street map of Charleston, one of my better pieces. What I love about old maps is that they show you how someone understood the world at a specific moment. The mistakes are as interesting as the accuracies. A cartographer draws what he can see, what he can measure, what he can reason from available evidence. He doesn't know what he doesn't know. I had drawn my map of Cody Fletcher the same way, measured what I could see, the practiced handshake, the vague answers, the financial questions, and reasoned myself into thinking I was overreacting. Now I knew what I hadn't known. I drove home on the long way, through the old part of the island where the live oaks have grown over the road and made a tunnel of gray-green shade. I used to take Nicole that way on Saturday mornings when she was small, driving slow while she pressed her face against the glass and announced the shapes she saw in the leaves: a horse, a whale, something she called a leaf dragon, which I thought was a perfectly reasonable category. She'd tap my shoulder from the back seat. "Dad, look." And I'd look, because she wanted me to, and because there was nowhere else worth looking. I hadn't thought about the leaf dragons in years. Grief picks its moments. I thought about the first time Cody joined us for a Sunday dinner, about 8 months after Nicole introduced us. She'd been nervous beforehand, which was unlike her, and that nervousness had made me want to like him. He'd been attentive to Nicole, asked reasonable questions about my work, complimented the food. When he helped clear the plates, she'd caught my eye over his shoulder and given me the smallest possible look, a question in the shape of a glance. I'd nodded, because she needed me to, because she was happy. I'd measured what I could see, and I'd reasoned myself into thinking I was a suspicious old man. I hadn't known what I didn't know. That mistake had cost 2 years and $1,200,000. Back at the house, I sat in my study, the room where I keep the maps, floor to ceiling on 3 walls, and opened my laptop, not randomly. I had a name from the power of attorney, a notary firm out of Columbia, South Carolina. I had 2 LLC names from the wire transfers. I had a timeline, and I had 31 years of knowing how people hide things. Within 2 hours, I had enough loose threads to know I was pulling on something real. A man who sells commercial real estate in Charleston should have a traceable footprint in Charleston commercial real estate. Cody Fletcher's footprint was a careful negative space, the outline of a presence without the substance. Instinct asks a question. Documentation answers it. I needed documentation. There was a name in a state court record database, a Charleston investigator, former federal background, now private. Glenn Watts, James Island address. No personal connection to me, which was exactly right. I didn't need a friend. I needed a professional. I picked up my phone. It was early evening by then, the light going orange over the water. Somewhere in my house, in the back bedroom, Cody Fletcher's spare jacket was hanging on a hook behind the door. He'd left it there 3 weeks ago. He'd asked if it was fine to leave it, and I'd said sure, no problem, because at that point I was still performing the role of the pleasant future father-in-law. A customs inspector doesn't grab contraband at the entrance. He waits until the box is open. I dialed Glenn Watts's number and listened to it ring. Glenn Watts picked up on the 3rd ring. His voice was the kind that had spent years being professionally unremarkable. No accent you could place. No warmth he hadn't decided to offer. I told him I needed background work done on an individual, financial records, prior legal history, business entity research. He said he charged $180 an hour with a $1,500 retainer up front, that he worked alone, and that everything he produced would be documented and legally obtained. I said that was fine. He gave me an address on James Island and a time the following morning. I drove over the bridge at 8 o'clock with a folder of what I'd already gathered and a check for the retainer. His office was a converted ground floor unit in a building that looked like it had started life as a dentist's practice. Plain waiting area, 2 chairs, a desk that was completely clear except for a legal pad. Watts was 51, broad-shouldered, with close-cropped gray hair and the particular stillness of someone who had learned to listen for a living. He didn't offer his hand when I walked in. He gestured to the chair across from his desk and said, "Tell me what you have." I told him everything. He took notes. He asked 4 questions, all of them precise. The date range of the transactions, the names on the LLCs, the name of the notary firm in Columbia, whether I had physical copies of the power of attorney document. I handed him what I had. He looked at it without expression. 10 days, he said, maybe less. It was 9 days. I spent those 9 days performing normalcy with the concentration of a man diffusing something delicate. Cody was at the house 3 times that week. Nicole's wedding was now 6 weeks out, and the logistical conversations had reached the point where they required my presence. Rehearsal dinner details, seating arrangements, the question of whether the Sullivan's Island house would be available for family to stay. I sat at the kitchen table and answered questions about seating arrangements with the same measured tone I used to use when a cargo manifest didn't add up and I needed the person across from me to keep talking. Cody was relaxed. That was the tell if I needed another one. He'd been noticeably more relaxed over the past 2 months, since I now understood the last of the transfers had cleared. The job was done, from his perspective. All that remained was the ceremony itself, the signed marriage license, and the next phase of whatever plan he'd constructed. He laughed more easily. He poured himself a second glass of wine without asking. He called me Ralph now instead of Sir, which he'd started doing right around the time the power of attorney was executed. I noticed all of it. I catalogued it quietly, the way I catalogued cargo, not with anger, but with precision. His mother, Diane Fletcher, came to dinner the Thursday of that week. She was 61, dressed in the way of someone who has decided that visible expense is a form of communication. She talked about the wedding venue as though she had opinions she was generously restraining. She talked about her son's portfolio, a word I had come to regard the same way I regarded words like transition period, as a placeholder for things that didn't exist. When I mentioned the map collection, she said, "Oh, the old maps," in the tone a person uses when they've decided something is slightly embarrassing. "Do they actually sell for much?" she asked. "Some of them," I said. "Hmm." She picked up her wine glass with the expression of someone filing that away under probably not worth bothering with. What she didn't know was that my 1847 Charleston Harbor survey had been appraised at $16,500 the previous spring. I hadn't corrected her. I was developing a preference for being underestimated. Watts called on a Thursday afternoon, 9 days after our first meeting, and said he had a complete file. I drove back to James Island that same evening. The folder he placed on the desk was 1.5 inches thick. In 2017, Cody Fletcher had been convicted in Fulton County, Georgia, of financial fraud, specifically the fraudulent execution of a power of attorney against an elderly relative. Suspended sentence, 3 years probation since expired. Public record. It had simply never come up, because Nicole had never thought to look and I had never thought I needed to. The notary firm in Columbia had a complaint pending with the South Carolina Secretary of State's office. One of the 2 LLCs named in my wire transfers had been dissolved 4 weeks after the transfer cleared. The other was still active registered agent address, corresponding to a mail drop in Wilmington, Delaware. Watts had traced enough of the money to confirm Cody Fletcher as beneficial owner. "This is enough?" I asked. "For a civil claim, yes. For a criminal referral, probably yes. You want an attorney to time it correctly." He paused. "You don't want him to know you have this until the moment you use it." That was already understood. I drove home with the folder on the passenger seat and sat in the study for an hour with the lights low. On the wall across from me hung the 1842 Charleston street map, the one that showed the city as it was when no one who drew it had any idea what it was about to go through. You draw the map you can draw, you work with what you have, and then you decide what to do with it. 6 weeks until the wedding. 6 weeks to get everything in place. I opened my laptop and searched for attorneys specializing in civil fraud and elder financial abuse in Charleston. Margaret Coleman's name appeared in 3 separate search results, each from a different source. I wrote her name on the legal pad I'd bought for this purpose and circled it once. Then I went to bed. I slept well, which surprised me at the time. It doesn't surprise me anymore. Margaret Coleman's office was on Meeting Street, 4th floor, in a building with tall windows that looked south toward the water. She was 53, with the kind of focused attention that tells you a person charges for their time because their time actually produces something. She read through Watts's file without speaking, made 4 notes on a yellow pad, and then looked up at me. "How long until the wedding?" she asked. 5 weeks and 3 days, I said. She nodded slowly, the way someone nods when they're measuring the distance between 2 points. "The power of attorney fraud is your strongest foundation. We have the forged instrument, the prior conviction, the LLC structure. That's a SC code 16-13-230 violation. Financial fraud by exploitation. It carries up to 5 years and full restitution." She tapped her pen against the pad. The civil claim for unjust enrichment runs parallel. We recover what was taken. But the timing matters. If we file prematurely, he moves the assets. I know, I said. The wedding, she said again. Not a question this time. He'll be standing at an altar in front of 200 people who know him and his mother. He won't be watching his accounts. He won't be watching anything except my daughter walking up the aisle. Coleman looked at me for a moment with an expression I couldn't quite name. Not admiration, exactly. More like the recognition of a specific kind of patience. I can have everything prepared and ready to file in 3 weeks. We hold it until the morning of the ceremony. I'll need a process server lined up and briefed. She paused. The asset freeze request goes in simultaneously with the civil complaint. The moment the clerk stamps the filing, we notify the Delaware registered agents. He won't be able to move anything. What do you need from me? She gave me a list. Original bank statements, the complete transaction history Patricia Weston had pulled, a sworn affidavit from me attesting that I had not executed or authorized the power of attorney, and written authorization to engage a forensic document examiner to analyze the signature. I had most of it already. The rest I could have within 2 days. Over the next 3 weeks, I became a different kind of regular at the copy shop on Coleman Boulevard. I drove to Coleman's office twice more to review affidavits. I sat across from a forensic document examiner named James Hurst, an independent notary and document analyst who worked out of a modest office on Rutledge Avenue, and watched him spend 40 minutes with the power of attorney under a magnification lamp before saying, with the quiet certainty of someone reporting a weather forecast, that the signature was not genuine. The pen pressure was inconsistent with normal hand movement. The letter formation suggested deliberate reconstruction rather than natural execution, and there was no matching thumbprint in the space where the original bank protocol required one. He produced a 6-page report. I paid him $650 and shook his hand. At home, I kept performing normalcy. I attended a joint dinner with Cody and Nicole at a restaurant on East Bay Street. I listened to Cody describe, in some detail, an investment deal he was finalizing in Atlanta. Something to do with a mixed-use development, a partner in Buckhead, numbers that were vague in the way that real numbers never are. I asked a few polite questions. He answered them with the comfortable ease of a man who has told a particular story so many times it has stopped feeling like a story. Diane was there, too. She mentioned 3 times in 2 hours that the Planters Inn ballroom, where the reception was being held, was a beautiful choice, with just enough emphasis on choice to suggest she found it adequate rather than impressive. When Nicole excused herself for a moment, Diane leaned across the table slightly and said to me, "You must be so relieved she found someone stable." She said it with the smile of someone delivering a sentence that is not, technically, an insult. I told her I was very happy for Nicole. I smiled the whole time. 31 years at the border, and the one thing I know for certain is that the most useful face you own is the one that reveals nothing. By the end of the 3rd week, everything was prepared. Coleman had the filings ready, the process server briefed, the Delaware asset freeze notification staged and waiting. Watts had confirmed that the 2 active LLC accounts were still holding the bulk of the transferred funds. They hadn't moved. Cody had no reason to think anyone was looking. The wedding was in 8 days. I went into the study that evening, sat down at the table where the maps were spread, and looked at the 1842 Charleston chart for a while. The city in that map had no idea what was ahead of it. The cartographer had done his best work with what was available, drawn every street and waterway he could reach, and produced something careful and accurate and ultimately incomplete. Because the map is never the territory, and the territory always has more going on than the map shows. I reached for the legal pad and wrote down a single line. Not a plan exactly, more like a conclusion I'd arrived at gradually over the preceding weeks, the way you arrive at a destination when you've been reading the route carefully. He thinks this is over. He's been wrong about that since the moment he drew that signature. The organist at St. Philip's Episcopal plays a processional that I'd been told lasts approximately 4 minutes. In 4 minutes, I needed to walk my daughter down that aisle, And while I was doing that, Margaret Coleman was going to be sitting in her office on Meeting Street with her hand on a phone, waiting for my text. One word, that was all she needed. I wrote that word on the pad too, circled it, and closed the notebook. 8 days. The morning of the wedding was clear and cool, that particular early fall light that Charleston does well, where everything looks slightly more deliberate than usual, like the city dressed up for the occasion. I was awake before 6. I made coffee, sat on the porch, and watched a pelican work its way along the waterline with the unhurried efficiency of something that has been doing the same job for a very long time. I had been awake since 4:30, not from anxiety, more the way you stay awake the night before a long trip. Not because you're worried about it, but because part of your mind is already on the road. I had sent Coleman the text at 6:53. One word, ready. She replied in under 2 minutes. Confirmed. Server is in position. Filing at 9. The ceremony was scheduled for 10 o'clock at St. Philip's Episcopal on Church Street, one of the oldest churches in Charleston, white columns and a steeple that has been navigating ships into the harbor since before the Revolution. Nicole had chosen it. She loved old things with history in them, which is something she gets from me, though the irony of that in the current circumstances was not lost on me. I put on my suit. It was charcoal gray, the one I wore for occasions that required a certain kind of seriousness. I had last worn it to a retirement ceremony at the port 3 years prior. It still fit. I knotted my tie in the bathroom mirror and noticed that I looked calm. I was calm. That surprised me a little. Somewhere in the past 6 weeks, the anger had finished burning and left something colder and more useful in its place. Nicole was getting ready at a friend's house across the island. She didn't know the exact timing of what I had arranged, only the shape of it. I had sat with her 2 days earlier at the kitchen table and told her plainly what was going to happen. She'd been quiet for a long time after I finished talking. "You've had this ready for weeks," she said. 3 weeks and 4 days, I confirmed. She looked at me with the expression she used as a child when she was recalibrating her understanding of something. "And you didn't tell me." "I didn't want you to have to perform knowing it. The ceremony needed to look like a ceremony, right up until it didn't." She was quiet again, then, "The lunch is still booked?" "Planters in, noon. Prepaid, non-refundable." I paused. "The guests came from out of town. They deserve a meal." Nicole looked at me for a moment. Something shifted in her face. Not quite a smile, not quite tears. She reached across the table and put her hand over mine. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. I drove to St. Philip's at 9:30. The parking on Church Street was already filling. Nicole had invited about 200 people, a mix of her professional contacts, college friends, and the assorted social infrastructure that accumulates around a Charleston family over 64 years. I recognized perhaps a third of them. I parked 2 blocks away and walked. The interior of St. Philip's was all pale plaster and dark wood, and the particular quality of stillness that comes from centuries of accumulated occasion. Flowers along every pew, white and pale green, Nicole's choosing. The organ playing something slow and stately that I didn't know the name of. Guests finding their seats with the particular combination of formality and social energy that a wedding morning produces. Cody was already at the front of the church. He stood near the altar with 2 men I recognized as his friends from Atlanta. I had met them once at a rehearsal dinner preview. Men in their mid-30s with expensive haircuts and the self-satisfaction of people who have been told they're doing well enough times that they've stopped questioning it. Cody was laughing at something one of them said. He had his hands in his pockets and his shoulders back, the posture of a man completely at ease in the present moment. He looked good. He always looked good. That was part of how it worked. He caught my eye as I came down the aisle and gave me that particular smile. Open, warm, calibrated, the future father-in-law smile. I nodded once and kept walking to my seat in the front row. I sat down. I put my phone on silent, face down in my breast pocket. Coleman had the timing. Everything was prepared and in motion, and there was nothing left for me to do except be present, which is easier when you've learned to read the room, and the room is telling you exactly what you expected. I watched Cody stand at the front of the church and thought about the Georgia conviction, about the suspended sentence, about the notary firm in Columbia that had processed his forged instrument with the reliability of a service business filling an order, about the dissolved LLC, the active one in Delaware, the $1,200,000 that had moved across 3 accounts over 12 weeks, while I was sitting at dinner telling this man the chicken was good and keeping the suspicion in its box. He smiled at a guest walking past the front pew. Perfect smile. Practiced comfort. A man who had done this before and knew how it ended. In his favor, in his pocket, moving on to the next chapter. Not this time. The rear doors of the church opened. The organ shifted registers into the processional. Every head in the building turned. Nicole stood in the doorway with her bouquet. White flowers, green stems, the same arrangement she'd described to me 3 months ago over coffee, with the kind of specific enthusiasm that meant she'd been imagining it for a long time. She was wearing her mother's pearls. She looked the way Nicole always looked when she'd decided something, entirely committed to the surface of it, while doing something else entirely underneath. She walked up the aisle. I stood with the rest of the congregation and watched her come. At the point where the aisle met the front pew, she stopped beside me. She took my arm. She was close enough that I could see the exact moment her grip on the bouquet changed. Fingers pressing tighter, the small controlled tension of a person making sure of something. She turned her face slightly toward me, not enough for anyone else to notice, and in that movement, she pressed something into my right hand. A folded piece of paper, small, tucked in from between the flower stems. I closed my fingers around it. She faced forward again. The music continued. Cody stood at the altar with his smile and his practiced ease, watching us walk toward him with the confidence of a man who is watching the final piece arrive. I unfolded the paper with one hand, keeping it below the level of the bouquet. 4 lines, her handwriting, precise and unhurried even under the circumstances. She has her mother's jaw and my attention to what matters. Dad, he stole $1.2 million from your accounts. Forged POA. I found the transfer records 2 days ago. Don't let this happen. I read it twice. I folded it back along its creases. I put it in the pocket of my jacket, where it sat beside the phone that was already carrying Coleman's confirmation from that morning. I looked at Cody Fletcher standing at the altar. He looked back at me with his perfect smile, warm and certain, the smile of a man watching the last door close behind him. I gave Nicole one slow nod. Her grip on my arm changed. I felt the moment she decided. The music reached the end of its phrase. The officiant, an older man with white hair and the seasoned composure of someone who has presided over a great deal of human complexity, looked out at the congregation and began his opening remarks. Nicole stood perfectly still beside me, and she did not move toward the altar. The officiant's voice trailed off. He was a professional, and he recovered faster than most of the room. His expression shifted from practiced ceremony to careful attention with the speed of someone who understood that the situation had changed and was waiting to learn what it had changed into. The guests in the first few rows noticed Nicole's stillness within about 4 seconds. The ripple moved backward through the pews. The slight murmur, the turned heads, the collective recalibration of 200 people, realizing that what they were watching was not going according to the script. Cody's smile lasted longer than it should have. That was the first visible crack, the moment when the smile stayed in place past the point where it made sense, because the mechanism behind it hadn't caught up yet with what the situation required. He took a half step forward. "Nicole!" His voice was easy, measured, carrying just the right amount of gentle concern for the audience. "Hey, you okay?" Nicole said quietly and without any tremble in it. "I'm not going to do this, Cody." The silence that followed lasted perhaps 3 seconds. It felt considerably longer. I stood beside her and said nothing. I have stood at inspection stations for 31 years watching people discover that the situation is not what they believed it was. The professional response is stillness. Let the other person fill the space. Cody filled it. I don't understand what... He glanced at the guest nearest the front, then back at Nicole, a reflex of a man who thinks about his audience even when his audience is the last thing he should be thinking about. This is... Nicole, come on. Everyone's here. Can we just... No, she said. Simple. Final. The word of someone who has completed a calculation. Cody's expression went through 3 changes in about 2 seconds. The attempt to keep the charming surface, then a flash of something harder underneath it, then a rapid reassembly into a different kind of performance. The confused, wronged fiancé. He spread his hands slightly. I don't know what's happened here, but whatever you've heard, whatever someone has said... Cody. I said his name once, not loudly. The way you speak to someone when you want them to understand, you have their full attention. He looked at me. There it was, the first real look, not the son-in-law smile. Something underneath, assessing me with the quick calculation of a man figuring out what other people know and don't know. You already signed everything you needed to sign, I said. You just don't know about it yet. His face went very still, working the sentence, trying to determine what I meant, whether it was a bluff, what it would mean if it wasn't. He had moved $1,200,000 through forged documents and 2 Delaware LLCs, and he had watched me sit at his dinner table talking about seating arrangements, and he had concluded that the pleasant old customs inspector was exactly what he appeared to be. That conclusion had cost him more than he knew yet. Diane Fletcher was on her feet now, moving to the aisle with the purposeful speed of someone accustomed to managing situations before they become visible problems. I think the bride might just need a moment. It's a very emotional... Sit down, Diane, I said. The words came out quiet and even, not rude. The tone of someone who has decided that a sentence is necessary and is saying it. Her mouth closed. She sat down. Cody had pulled out his phone. He was checking something. Accounts, most likely. Whatever he saw changed his face in the way that faces change when the floor disappears. The color redistributed. That specific pallor of a man staring at a number that isn't what it's supposed to be. That's not... He said it to his phone, low. Then he looked up at me. What did you do? Nothing you didn't set in motion yourself? He stepped down from the altar, phone in hand, charm gone entirely, replaced by the operational person who lives under the surface. He got close enough that I could see the calculation still running behind his eyes. Ralph, whatever you think you know. Cody. Nicole's voice stopped him mid-sentence. She looked at him with the expression of someone who has finished grieving a thing she thought was real. I found the bank records 2 days ago. I've known since Tuesday. He looked at her, then at me. Then he turned and walked up the center aisle toward the rear doors. Not running, walking quickly, with the controlled urgency of a man trying to look like he's choosing to leave. The heavy oak doors closed behind him. 200 people sat in pale light and flowers and said nothing. I sent Coleman 1 text. He just left the building. Her reply came in 11 seconds. Server is outside. Filing is stamped. Outside, the morning was still clear and cool. Near the iron gate at the churchyard, a man in a gray suit was approaching Cody with a manila envelope, the process server Coleman had arranged 2 weeks prior. Cody saw him coming and stopped. He read the situation, and his body went through the visible sequence. Stillness, the instinct to move, recognition that moving would not change what the envelope contained. He took the envelope. He opened it. He read the top page of Coleman's civil complaint, SC Code 16-13-230, fraudulent execution of a general power of attorney, unjust enrichment, asset freeze, full restitution of $1,200,000 plus costs. His hand dropped to his side. Pages hung loose from his fingers. He found me standing 20 feet away with Nicole, and his face, the face that had smiled across 100 dinner tables, that had stood at an altar 10 minutes ago with the certainty of a man who believed he had already won, had nothing useful left in it. Diane came out of the church and took in the process server, the pages in her son's hand, and the general situation in about 3 seconds. She said something loud and sharp and entirely lost her composure in the way that a carefully maintained document loses its structure when it gets wet. First at the edges, then all at once. Cody stepped away from her and put his phone to his ear. By then, Watts's criminal referral materials were already on their way to the Charleston PD Financial Crimes Unit. The asset freeze had reached the Delaware registered agents by electronic filing. The accounts were locked. He could call anyone he wanted. There was nothing in those accounts that belonged to him anymore. I looked at my watch. 10:47. The lunch reservation at the Planters Inn was at noon. Prepaid, non-refundable. The guests had driven from Columbia, Savannah, as far as Charlotte. They deserved a meal. I turned to Nicole. Hungry? She looked at me with the expression I remembered from when she was small and had just watched me do something she hadn't entirely expected. Then she exhaled slowly, and something around her eyes relaxed. Yeah, she said. Actually, yeah. We walked back into the church together to tell 200 people that lunch was still on. The lunch at the Planters Inn lasted 2.5 hours. People ate. They asked careful questions and were kind to Nicole in the way people are kind when they've witnessed something they don't yet have a framework for. She answered them steadily. I paid the check and drove home to Sullivan's Island. The house was quiet. I made coffee and waited to feel something large, relief, satisfaction. Instead, I felt the flatness that comes after long preparation, the anticlimactic stillness of a checkpoint where the work is done and the results are out of your hands. I wasn't finished, and I knew it. A frozen account is not a recovered dollar. It came the following week. Coleman called me on a Tuesday morning. Her voice had the measured quality it gets when she's about to deliver something unpleasant without editorializing. Cody Fletcher has retained counsel, she said. Douglas Vane out of Columbia. You should know that name. I wrote it down. Should I? He's expensive, experienced, and he wins by making the other side's case complicated. His counterargument will be that you transferred those funds voluntarily, that the power of attorney was legitimately executed, and that Nicole acted as an agent of coercion. She paused. He filed this morning. Cody is claiming the $1,200,000 represented a verbal gift agreement, that you authorized the transfers as a pre-wedding gift to the couple. I sat with that for a moment. A gift. A verbal gift agreement, which by definition leaves no paper trail. That's creative, I said. Vane is creative. Another pause. There's something else. Watts called me this morning before I called you. There's a third LLC we didn't catch in the initial research. Registered in Delaware. Different name. Different registered agent. We believe $280,000 from the investment account liquidation passed through it before the freeze order was issued. It may be outside the current freeze. That number landed differently than the others. Not because it was large, it was, but so was the whole figure. But because it represented a gap in what I thought I'd known. Watts had been thorough. Cody had been more thorough. He'd built a redundancy into his structure that we hadn't found in time. And now $280,000 of my money was sitting somewhere that a Delaware registered agent could confirm existed but couldn't currently be touched. I told Coleman I'd be in her office the next morning. That afternoon I thought about Diane Fletcher's social circles. She'd been quiet since the wedding, no calls, no messages. But through Nicole's network, word filtered back that Diane had been describing the situation to certain mutual acquaintances as a case of an unstable retired man who had confused some financial paperwork. She had used the phrase early cognitive issues in at least one conversation that made its way back to me. I was 64. I had reviewed every line of those bank statements with perfect comprehension and coordinated a multi-track legal strategy across 6 weeks without a single inconsistency. Diane was seeding a narrative, building a character argument before it became formal, so that if the case required it, there would be witnesses who recalled having heard something concerning about Ralph Gardner's mental state. It was reasonably sophisticated. I gave her credit for that. I stood up and walked to the bookshelf in the corner, not the map cases, but the older storage, the archive boxes where I kept financial documentation going back 30 years. I had kept everything. That was habit from the port, where the rule was that anything documented was defensible and anything undocumented was a liability. I was looking for the original account agreement from when the Sullivan's Island investment account was first opened, 1997, with a predecessor bank that had since been acquired. I knew it existed. I had seen it in the archive box years ago when I was reorganizing. It took me 40 minutes of patient sorting. The document was in a manila envelope at the bottom of the third box. A 3-page agreement, my original signature at the bottom, and, as required by the bank's verification protocol at the time, my right thumbprint beside the notarization line. I held it under the lamp and looked at it for a while. Every subsequent financial document tied to that account, under the bank's own procedures, should have carried a matching biometric verification. The forged power of attorney had a notarization stamp, but no thumbprint. I had noticed this when Patricia Weston first showed me the document, but I had assumed it was an oversight in the forgery, a gap in the mimicry. I hadn't understood yet that it was also a gap in the bank's own verification chain. If the original account agreement required a thumbprint, and the power of attorney authorizing transfers from that account didn't carry one, then the bank had processed transactions under an instrument that failed its own authentication standard. That was a different argument, not just fraud against me, but a documentation failure on the bank's part that potentially opened a second avenue for recovery. I put the 1997 agreement in a separate folder, labeled it, and set it on the desk. Vane could argue verbal gift agreements. He could argue willing transfer. He could not forge a thumbprint that wasn't there. I called Coleman and told her what I'd found. There was a pause on the line that lasted about 4 seconds, the length of time it takes a person to fully understand something and decide what it means. "Bring it tomorrow," she said. James Hurst's office on Rutledge Avenue was exactly as I remembered it. Modest, orderly, the desk clear except for the magnification lamp and a single legal pad. I had called ahead. He knew what I was bringing. He spent 22 minutes with the 2 documents side by side, the 1997 account agreement with the authenticated thumbprint and the forged power of attorney with the notarization line that carried only ink. He made 4 notes on his legal pad. He did not look up until he was finished. "The space on the power of attorney where the biometric verification should appear," he said, "is blank. There is no print. There is no smear or partial impression that might suggest an attempt to provide one. The line exists on the form. The bank's standard template includes it, but it was left empty." He set down his pen. "In my professional opinion, this document was executed by someone who either did not know the authentication requirement existed or believed it would not be examined." I thought about Cody Fletcher's confidence, about the practiced handshake, about the ease with which he had sat at my kitchen table for 2.5 years, working the room the way he always worked every room. He had not known about the 1997 agreement. He'd known enough to forge a signature and find a cooperative notary in Columbia, but he hadn't gone far enough back through the documentation chain to find the original account protocol. That gap, 30 years of archive boxes in a corner of my study, was what was going to finish him. Hurst produced an amended report within 3 days. Coleman filed a supplemental brief the following morning, attaching the report and the 1997 agreement as exhibits. The brief argued that the absence of required biometric verification rendered the power of attorney void on its face under the bank's own authentication standards, independent of the forgery claim. You cannot use a document to authorize a transfer if it fails the institution's own verification requirements. The 2 arguments, forgery and authentication gap, closed the space Vane had been trying to occupy, but Vane filed a motion requesting a 3-week postponement, citing new exhibits. The circuit court granted it. Coleman told me the delay wasn't a setback. It was Vane recalibrating because his primary argument had just collapsed. I understood the distinction. 3 weeks is still 3 weeks. Watts found the third LLC the week after the hearing postponement. It was registered under a name that was structurally identical to one of the dissolved ones. Same word sequence, slightly different arrangement, the kind of thing that gets missed in a first pass of Delaware corporate filings. The registered agent address was a different mail drop in the same Wilmington zip code. The $280,000 was still in an account attached to it. The entity was active. It had been active when the asset freeze order was issued, which meant it should have been covered. Watts's read was that the registered agent had either missed the notification or processed it slowly enough that the money could have been moved before it landed. Coleman filed an emergency motion to extend the freeze order to the third LLC. The circuit court issued a temporary order the same day, pending a full hearing. That was a Friday afternoon. I was sitting in the study when Coleman called to confirm it. I put the phone down and looked at the wall. The 1842 Charleston map was there, the way it always was. I pulled it down, unrolled it on the table, and smoothed the edges. Every street named, every waterway measured, every boundary drawn with the best available precision. 31 years at a port, watching people move things through channels they believed were invisible. The channels are never invisible. They always leave a line on the map. I said to the room, "I've read routes my whole life. Yours ends here." Then I rolled the map back up and went to make dinner. The following Monday, Diane Fletcher received her summons. Watts had confirmed the third LLC was registered in her name, different from the first two, which had been Cody's alone. She was a named party in the amended civil complaint. She would need her own attorney. She would need to explain in a South Carolina circuit court what she had known and when she had known it. That same Monday, Cody walked into a bank branch on King Street and attempted to withdraw $40,000 in cash from an account he believed was separate from the frozen LLCs. The teller ran the account number. The freeze order had been updated that morning to include all accounts associated with the third LLC and its beneficial owners. He left the branch without the money. Coleman called me that evening with those two updates in sequence, delivered in the same measured tone she used for everything. I thanked her and said I'd see her at the next meeting. I sat in the study for a while after that. The hearing was 3 weeks out. Both Fletchers were now formally named defendants. The third LLC was frozen. The authentication gap had closed Vane's primary defense. What remained was the courtroom. I was ready for the courtroom. The Circuit Court of Charleston County occupied a building on Broad Street that had been dispensing legal outcomes since before I was born. I put on the charcoal gray suit and drove across the bridge in the early dark. Coleman met me on the front steps. "Vane filed a last-minute continuance request yesterday afternoon," she said. "The judge denied it this morning." I filed that away and followed her inside. The courtroom was smaller than people imagine. Dark wood paneling, fluorescent light, the institutional stillness of a room where consequential things happen without drama. Cody was already at the defendant's table. Dark suit, the expression of a man who has been told things could still go his way and is beginning to suspect otherwise. He did not look at me. Diane sat 2 rows back in the gallery, dressed carefully, her composure working harder than it used to. Judge Renata Okafor arrived at 9 exactly with the reputation Coleman had described. Reads every exhibit, does not appreciate procedural theater. Vane's opening argument was competent. He reframed the $1,200,000 as voluntary transactions authorized by a principal who subsequently changed his mind under family pressure. He characterized Nicole's involvement as motivated reasoning. He raised briefly the question of whether a retiree in his mid-60s might have experienced lapses of judgment. He did not belabor the point. He was too experienced to overreach. Coleman walked through each of the 3 transaction pathways in order: the $340,000 wire, the $510,000 investment account liquidation, the $350,000 property refinancing, connecting each to the forged power of attorney. She introduced Hearst's forensic report on the missing biometric verification, the 1997 account agreement showing the original authentication protocol, and Watts's documentation of the prior 2017 Georgia conviction. Vane objected to the Georgia conviction. Judge Okafor said it was admissible as evidence of a pattern, and moved on. Then Nicole testified. She sat in the witness stand and told the court that approximately 3 weeks before the wedding, she had noticed an unusual email notification about a document signature request tied to her father's investment account. She accessed the document, found a transfer authorization she didn't recognize, pulled the account activity further back, and found the other 2 transactions. She had contacted her father. Vane cross-examined her on whether she had discussed her findings with her father before drawing conclusions. She said yes. He asked whether she had a financial interest in the outcome. She said her only interest was the recovery of her father's assets. He had nothing else. Judge Okafor asked for the 1997 account agreement to be passed up to the bench. She examined it for approximately 90 seconds. She looked at the power of attorney beside it. She set both documents down. The authentication discrepancy is not a minor technical point, she said. The original account protocol required biometric verification for any power of attorney instrument. The document produced by the defendant does not contain that verification. The bank processed transfers under an instrument that failed its own authentication standard. That is a material defect. She looked at Vane. Does the defense have an explanation for the absent verification? Vane said that the verification had likely been obtained informally. The judge said that informally was not a recognized standard under the bank's own documentation protocol, and that this was not the kind of thing that could be handled informally. She turned back to the full record. She reviewed it for 4 minutes in complete silence. The courtroom was very quiet. Then she ruled. Full asset freeze on all 3 LLCs maintained. Summary judgment on the civil fraud claim in favor of the plaintiff. Civil restitution order of $920,000. The amount recoverable from the frozen accounts, with the remainder covered by a combination of Diane Fletcher's settlement agreement and the financial institution's liability acknowledgement for processing under a defective instrument. Vane was on his feet immediately with a preservation of objection for appeal. The judge acknowledged it and moved on. The criminal referral to the Charleston County Prosecutor's Office was already logged. That proceeding would run on its own schedule. Cody Fletcher sat at the defense table with his hands flat on the surface and said nothing. He had the look of someone who has run a calculation and arrived at a result he had not planned for. The charm was completely gone. Not suppressed, not managed, just absent, the way a performance disappears when the performer has stopped believing it will work. Diane Fletcher left the courtroom without looking at anyone. I watched her go. I sat beside Coleman and felt not triumph exactly, but the satisfaction of a task completed correctly, the same way I felt at the end of a long inspection shift, when the manifest had cleared and everything was accounted for. Coleman gathered her documents. The $920,000 restitution order will be executed within 30 days, the bank's liability portion within 60. She looked at me. The criminal proceeding will take longer. That's out of our hands. I told her I understood. We walked out onto Broad Street. The morning had turned clear and mild, the harbor visible between the buildings to the south. A week before Christmas, the civil restitution transferred into my account in 2 installments. $920,000 from the frozen LLCs, and an additional $280,000 from Diane Fletcher's settlement, combined with the bank's liability payment. The full $1,200,000 recovered in full 4 months after a Tuesday morning bank statement had cracked something open in my kitchen. Cody Fletcher was awaiting a criminal trial date as a named defendant in a financial fraud prosecution. Diane had retained separate counsel and was cooperating with the prosecutor's office in exchange for a reduced exposure agreement, a decision that, based on what Coleman told me, her son did not take well. I stood in the study that evening with the lights on low. The maps were on the walls the way they had always been. I picked up Nicole's note from the desk, the folded 4 lines I had carried in my jacket pocket since the morning of the wedding. I held it for a moment. Then I opened the 1889 South Carolina Atlas on the table, turned to the page for the Charleston coastline, and laid the note flat between the pages. I closed the atlas and put it back on the shelf next to the first map I had ever bought. A road survey of the Low Country, 1974. $2 at an estate sale when I was 13 years old. The phone rang an hour later. Nicole, I picked up. "Thank you," she said. "I spent 31 years looking people in the eye at the border," I told her. "You chose wrong, but you looked up in time." She was quiet for a moment, then said good night. I put the phone down, made coffee, and sat on the porch. The Atlantic was flat and dark and completely indifferent. The new year was 10 days out. I was ready for it. If you liked this story, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your impressions of this story in the comments. To listen to the next story, click on the box on the left. Thank you for watching.